Let's travel back to the world that your grandparents may have known in the 1960s. In that world, the top tax rate for the wealthiest Americans was about 70%. Powerful labor unions negotiated high wages and generous benefits, and major industries like airlines, telecommunications, and banking were tightly regulated by the government. Now, fast forward to today. Unions are weaker, taxes on the rich have plummeted, markets are more open, but inequality has soared. So, how did we get from there to here? The answer lies in the chaotic decade of economic crisis, the 1970s, that shattered faith in the old economic consensus and unleashed a powerful counter revolution in favor of free markets. This is the origin story of the globalized, unequal, and dynamic economy we live in today. To understand how neoliberalism came to dominate the global economy, we have to start with the crisis that cleared the way for it: stagflation. In the decades after World War II, most governments in the industrialized world followed some version of Keynesian economics. The goal was to maintain full employment, keep inflation under control, and grow the economy through active government management. But in the 1970s, this system ran into serious trouble. A series of oil shocks beginning in 1973 caused energy prices to skyrocket. At the same time, wage price spirals, in which rising wages pushed prices up and rising prices pushed wages up, fueled inflation across much of the economy. Meanwhile, global financial instability intensified after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, which had previously helped stabilize exchange rates. The result was a toxic combination of high inflation and high unemployment, a condition known as stagflation. This was more than just an economic problem, it was an intellectual and political crisis. According to the logic of the Phillips curve that had guided post-war policy, inflation and unemployment were supposed to move in opposite directions. You could manage one, but at the cost of the other. But now, both were rising at the same time, and that wasn't supposed to happen. Keynesian economists struggled to explain it. Governments tried stimulus, wage controls, even rationing, but nothing seemed to work. Public frustration grew. People were angry about rising prices, job losses, and declining trust in government. Economists and politicians alike began to look for new answers. And that's when a different vision of how economies should work began to gain traction. This was the beginning of what we now call neoliberalism. Unlike Keynesianism, which argued that governments must actively manage the economy, neoliberal thinkers believed that governments were part of the problem, not the solution. At the heart of neoliberalism was a simple idea: free markets work best when left alone. Neoliberal policy called for reducing the size of the government, privatizing public services, cutting taxes, especially on business and the wealthy, deregulating industries, and, above all, restoring market discipline, especially by fighting inflation, even if it meant higher unemployment in the short term. Before we continue, it's worth clarifying something. In this lecture, we're talking about neoliberalism as an economic philosophy, a set of ideas about how markets and states should function, especially under globalization. But in international relations theory, neoliberal institutionalism means something different. There, it refers to the belief that even in an anarchic international system, states can cooperate through institutions, rules, and regimes to achieve mutual gains, especially in trade, security, and the environment. So, while both use the term neoliberal, one focuses on domestic and global markets, and the other on international cooperation. And while the term neoliberalism echoes 19th century classical liberalism, which emphasized free markets and limited government, neoliberalism emerged in a very different context. It sought to revive those ideas after decades of Keynesianism, but adapted them to a globalized, post-industrial world. The two most important intellectual architects of this movement were Friedrich Hayek, who warned in The Road to Serfdom that economic planning would inevitably lead to tyranny, and Milton Friedman, who argued that monetary policy, not fiscal stimulus, should be the main tool of economic management, and that too much government interference distorted markets and undermined freedom. As Friedman put it, the government solution to a problem is usually as bad as the problem. For these thinkers, the role of the state wasn't to manage the economy, but to create and defend the market itself. This meant protecting private property rights, enforcing contracts, and using state power to break down barriers to competition, but then getting out of the way of the market's operation. While Keynes had once said that markets needed to be embedded in society, neoliberals tended to believe that society should adapt to the market, not the other way around. At first, these ideas were marginal, promoted by think tanks, university economists, and libertarian activists. But the crisis of the 1970s gave them an opening. Policymakers, frustrated with rising inflation and slow growth, began to turn to neoliberalism as both a solution and a new economic orthodoxy. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, neoliberalism moved from the margins of economic thought to the center of political power, with Margaret Thatcher's election as British Prime Minister in 1979 and Ronald Reagan's election as President of the United States in 1980. Both came to power during periods of economic turmoil and promised to reverse the course of what they saw as overextended government and overregulated economies. Thatcher famously decried that there is no alternative, and Reagan opened his presidency by saying the government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. Under their leadership, neoliberalism became not just an economic policy, but a political project. In both countries, governments moved dramatically to cut taxes, especially on corporations and the wealthy, privatize public industries and services, deregulate sectors like finance, transportation, and energy, weaken labor unions by limiting collective bargaining and reducing the power of organized labor, and focusing on controlling inflation rather than reducing unemployment. But neoliberalism didn't stay confined to the global north. Beginning in the 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s, international institutions like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank began promoting, or in many cases imposing, neoliberal reforms across the global south. These were known as structural adjustment programs, or SAPs. But for now, just remember the basic idea. These programs were designed to reorient developing economies away from state-led development towards integration into the global market, using loans as leverage to enforce this shift. Because many countries were heavily indebted and facing balance of payments crises, institutions like the IMF and World Bank held enormous leverage, offering loans only if countries agreed to adopt market-friendly reforms. These conditionalities included cutting public spending, opening economies to foreign trade and investment, privatizing state-owned enterprises, removing price controls and subsidies, and devaluing national currencies, and so on. This was the Washington Consensus in action, a set of neoliberal economic prescriptions developed in and enforced by Washington-based institutions. For many countries in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia, this meant deep cuts to social services, rising inequality, and a loss of economic sovereignty. In theory, these reforms were supposed to foster growth and efficiency, but in practice, they often led to greater vulnerability, weaker public institutions, and increased dependence on global markets. Neoliberalism promised a more efficient, more dynamic global economy, and in some ways it delivered. Supporters point to the reduction of inflation, increased global trade, and the rise of emerging markets as signs of success. The 1980s and 1990s saw the acceleration of globalization, the spread of new technologies, and a surge of financial flows across borders. But these gains came at a cost. One of the most common critiques of neoliberalism was that it prioritized markets over people, that it treated economic growth as the goal rather than as a means of achieving social well-being. And while economies grew, wealth became increasingly concentrated. In many countries, the gap between rich and poor widened significantly, and the middle-class wages stagnated, especially in the global north. Unions were weakened, labor standards rolled back, and job security declined. The result was more precarious work, especially in manufacturing and service sectors. Structural adjustment often meant deep cuts to education, healthcare, housing, and food subsidies, especially in the global south. The most vulnerable populations bore the brunt of austerity. Critics argue that neoliberalism reduced the space for democratic decision-making. Policies were increasingly shaped by international markets and institutions rather than by voters or local communities. By pushing for deregulation and resource extraction, neoliberalism often accelerated environmental harm, undermining long-term stability in pursuit of short-term growth. These critiques fueled global resistance, from the Zapatistas in Mexico to the anti-globalization protests in Seattle in 1999, to calls for degrowth, climate justice, or economic democracy today. Critics of neoliberalism have challenged the idea that markets alone deliver fairness, freedom, or stability. And as a result, for many, the legacy of neoliberalism is a paradox. It's globalized opportunity, but also globalized insecurity. The economic crisis of the 1970s shattered the post-war Keynesian consensus and opened the door to a new era. Neoliberalism, once a fringe set of ideas, became the dominant model for organizing the global economy, redefining the role of the state, the market, and even the citizen. For some, this shift brought growth, innovation, and global integration. But for others, it unleashed decades of inequality, austerity, and instability. Today, we're living in the world that this revolution built. The debate over its legacy and the search for a new consensus in an age of rising inequality, climate crisis, and political backlash is the central economic and political challenge of our time. And unlike our grandparents, we now know that the world we inhabit isn't fixed, it can be transformed.